of how as a community we can come together to work on issues of geospatial standards and how they relate to actual real world issues such as ones we'll hear about later this morning, such as the Arctic and so on. There's a link there which you can go and have a look. It's a public-facing wiki, so anybody can get at it. One point about this session, what we're seeing now is the graphic result of the St. John's meeting. We also have Ali Marshall here in Calgary who will do the same again. So at the one of the outcomes or the outputs from this session will be another fantastic graphic. This is a really valuable thing. Within about 24 hours when this was done in St. John's, Newfoundland, it had already traveled around the world to places like Australia and being shared. So it's a really good opportunity to visually represent what we do at this meeting. There we go. So what is the Canadian Forum on Geospatial Standards? It's a platform for collaboration and consensus. More importantly, it's a platform to identify priority issues, items, and work that the group would like to do. Also, there's an outreach function. We've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years speaking about the Canada Forum and what it's for at a number of Canadian events from coast to coast to coast. There is a significant market development aspect to it as well. So, at the end of the day, this is about societal growth, protection, economic growth, protection, and resilience, amongst other things. More to come on that from the speakers. Very importantly, historically, the various sectors in Canada have, especially on standards, have been somewhat fragmented. So there's a heavy focus on what we call cross-community aspects. And by community, we'll hear more about what this means a little later, but by community, that's all of us. Whether you're private sector, public sector, indigenous, provincial, local, academic, research, not-for-profit. The idea is to get a lot better at reducing the fragmentation in this area of Canada in general. Also capacity building. And once again, Indigenous and remote communities. We've got lots of challenges in small communities all through the north of Canada, for example, and not just the north. So we're in a really exciting time right now, just both in Canada and around the world. There's a lot of really, really fantastic advances in terms of new sensors, new data sources, velocity of data sources, be it from mobile phones, be it from Earth observation sources, be it from wherever, from your own vehicles, your cars. But at the same time, we also live in a kind of a scary time. Topically speaking, we look at Hurricane Dorian, that's just one of it. But the evidence out there is increase in extreme events, floods, fires, and somehow, some way, we as a community, with a contribution and collaboration with the global community, have to get better at finding ways to share vital information. So as I say, it's both interesting times and it's also kind of scary and challenging times. Is there a question online? No? Okay, thank you. So we know that geospatial standards support interoperability in providing meaningful and effective and efficient ways to help manage and get better at both the interesting challenges and the kind of scary challenges. So this graphic here is a notional graphic. The idea is what we really want to focus on is the sort of circular relationship between kind of like applications on the left-hand or the right-hand side of the graphic and the various Canadian sectors at the top. So with innovation, growth, all of this is related to helping and improving what we're trying to attain here. One point Standards are more than just talking about metadata. Standards are also talking about services, it's talking about APIs, it's talking about policy, it's talking about communities of practice, it's talking about best practices. Often what tends to happen is people go right to the metadata side for that, and that's an important fundamental aspect of it. But in the context of the Canadian Forum, we're trying to make sure people think in a more broader way. So there's policy, there's economics, all of that sort of stuff, the full 9 yards. Okay. I won't dwell too long on this slide because I meant to not take up this much time, but ideally what we're trying to do is come up with practical ways and volunteers to help with agreement on work items. You'll hear more, or potential work items. You'll hear more about that later. So some of the potential outcomes could be selection work items. The work items that will be discussed today come from consultation over the last 18 months or so, so none of these should be a surprise to anybody. Perhaps another potential outcome is after the meeting, we have a series of dedicated individuals and volunteers who are willing to actively work on whatever those identified work items tend to be or are. We have identified a solid milestone, which are the OGC meetings hosted by CAE in Montreal, June 2020, where whatever the work items and whatever volunteers have decided to do, come back and report out in terms of the progress that has been made on whatever the work items that are identified. And of course, there could be other outcomes. We're open. This is an open forum. Discussion is important and participation is important. And with that, I'll move on to the first set of speakers, which will be Cameron Wilson Enercan, talking about the Arctic. Just so you know, at the end of each of the 4 morning presentations, there will be 3 or 4 minutes available for questions, both from people in the room and also people online. So thank you. Cameron?
Thank you, Trevor. How do I minimize this? Can I?
Little arrows up there.
Well, it's hard to see it.
I think I can.
There. Alrighty then. Good morning, everyone. The view from the podium is much better than the view that you have. Sorry, I was just awestruck there when I looked out the window. This place is just remarkable. Trevor gave a very good introduction. So one of the drivers for this, I mean, before the Canada Forum, there was a North American Forum. We noticed that, like it was hard to get sort of the Canadian agenda in there, and for a variety of reasons. So there's a bunch of drivers for this as Canada in a very complex world right now on all sides. So what do we want to do as Canadians? It's basically this. So we've got these various presentations, and as I think Trevor made an excellent point, this is about a conversation. So right now, we're sort of talking to you, but please feel free to interrupt, call us out, tell us, because when I say us, I don't mean the organizers, I mean us, all of us, and so we can have a healthy conversation. So this is a presentation about some of the activities we're doing in the Arctic from a SDI, Spatial Data Infrastructure, and Standards lens. Max, jeez.
Bring the focus back.
Go, there we go.
Okay,
right arrow. So, Arctic overview. So, I was born in 1958 in Ottawa. My parents are from Manitoba. So there's a lot of, Canadianisms, and they were in the force. My dad was in the forces. So you get a lot of that patriotism sort of built into your DNA over the decades. And so, the national anthem is the true North, strong and free. So, and that's, core to us as Canadians. And unfortunately, climate change has completely disproportional effects in the polar regions. There was a recent study by Environment Canada and climate change on, the magnifier in the Arctic was probably about 2 to 2.5 times what it is in the rest of the world, which is significant. And when you combine that with, the very remote communities, very low populations, huge distances, permafrost, a reliance on home food as opposed to shipping food in. These are all very serious issues. And infrastructure is going to collapse effectively as permafrost melts. There are neighbors as Canada. To the south we have the United States. We've got Asia to the left, Russia to the north, Europe to the east. So we're in the nexus of this huge geography and much greater interest in navigation on polar routes, primarily over Russia, from effectively the European Union across to China via Russia. We've done a lot of good work with Russia, the United States, all the Nordic countries, and Canada, of course, on an international Arctic SDI. And part of this presentation is how can we transfer those lessons learned into the Canadian Arctic. In our conversations with the territories, the capacity for territories to respond to this sort of request is basically their capacity starts very high in the west and diminishes as you go east. So Yukon has, and you see this in terms of the number of web services that are published, Yukon has 44 web services online, Northwest Territories has 5, Nunavut has 0. And when we talk to people, whether they're in Yukon, in any of the territories, they're short-staffed. Staff can rotate in and out, and the staff that are there are just focused on basic stuff: street addressing, fire department, addiction issues, health issues, very basic issues. So they're busy with that. So how do we leverage this international momentum for Canada's Arctic? So I have a couple slides here. This is only a 6-slide deck, so even though I'm blabbing on, I'll try to make it concise. So in the Arctic SDI, we have this very strong governance and set of user requirements. Governance comes through what was known as the Yellowknife Declaration in Canada in 2007. Our main marching orders, or the main client, is Arctic Council, which is the highest level of authority in the Arctic, right up to ambassador and diplomat level. And we're able to create, via standards, a comprehensive view of the Arctic. So part of that is a circumpolar map of the Arctic, coming from all those countries, combined via basically a cascading WMS sort of situation. We have an Arctic digital elevation model, which was funded by the National Science Foundation, oddly enough, as one of Obama's last orders. So we all benefit from these activities. A current requirement from Iceland, as they're chairing Arctic Council, is the ability to calculate glacial volume. So this is a big effort. Like, how do we calculate change of the volume of glaciers over time? So, and suffice to say, similar to the presentations yesterday, we were very good at collaborative environments. I think we're still seen somewhat as an honest broker, sometimes not. But we're able to bring these things together. Is there water in here? Just a bit. Okay. I don't know, I'm a bit short on water or something. Thanks. So one of the best meetings I was ever had in my life was in Copenhagen. And the reason it was a very good meeting is we had all the representatives from the International Hydrographic Organization, from around the Arctic, all the representatives from the land-based organizations from the Arctic. And by the time we had done the roundtable, that meeting, between 9 and 9:15 in the morning, we had all come to agreement. It was amazing, because we were all standards people. We all understood what was going on, and everybody's looking, okay, now what do we talk about for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes? And what came out of that was a Arctic marine spatial data infrastructure. And we see a lot of activity in the International Hydrographic Organization and within the OGC. Excuse me. Thanks, Trevor. So one of the requirements from Arctic Council, and it seems like a very valid requirement and a value for standards, is that they're looking at ecosystem-based monitoring. So when you're talking about ecosystem-based monitoring, right away you're talking about cross boundaries. You're across jurisdictions, you're across cultures, because frankly nature doesn't care about our constructs. They have their own constructs. So how do we use these wide variety of standards to have these data feeds? So we've been taking things from all the countries, and what I'm quite proud to say is the Arctic So all this data goes into a geoportal. It's all standards driven. And it's one of those few applications. It's an open source application based on the Oscari platform out of Europe. And it's one of the few applications, and I'm sure there are others, that really supports time series data really well through our WMS temporal analysis. And time series is critical. It also supports multiple character sets, so whether it's Russian or indigenous Slavics or Roman characters, it works. Available in a variety of polar projections. And the neat part is this has this embedded map function. So all the, sorry to say, but the complexity of OGC, the complexity of standards can be embedded, because effectively what this application does is it has an API entry, and that API sort of hides all that complexity and just allows people to embed a map into their website, which is automatically updated as the web services are updated. So this could be a potential output of these discussions today, and I don't know if you mentioned, Trevor, but what we're aiming for is the next OGC meeting in Canada, which will be in Montreal in June next year. So we're trying to tease out a narrative and action items today with follow-on discussions. So at one point when I was in the, this diagram goes back about 4 or 5 years, and at that point in Arctic SDI, I don't think half the people in the meetings understood what an SDI was. And we had sort of these contentious, friendly, collaborative arguments, I guess you'd call it. And so my boss, Prashant Shukla, he suggested what he called a herringbone diagram. So this is a herringbone diagram to show where do we want to go over time. Very simple diagram to say who are the users, what are the data, what are the standards. And we now have to update this because now we have the marine side. But it provided a useful tool to have a common vision, and everybody sort of saw themselves in this. Perhaps this is something we can do for Canada. There's an aspirational goal for Arctic SDI that's being socialized right now to create basically a 6-dimensional Arctic spatial data infrastructure. So those 6 dimensions would be, of course, what we think is lat long, but they could be other sort of coordinates. There's things like DGGS, there are other coordinate systems where you may want to define where you are on the Earth. There's a very strong temporal element to this, because this is all about change over time. There's an elevation component, but also the elevation in this construct is geological, bathymetric, elevation, and altitude. So we're engaging with the geology community, we're engaging with the water communities, the marine community, and the World Meteorological Organization is sort of next on the hit list. Vectors. In the Arctic, food is very important, oceans are very important, and all those things have flow to them. So what will be vectors of influence that we can map in this for, say, caribou, whales, whatever. And this is sort of a new one, because it was a 5-dimensional one until about 2 weeks ago, is information. So there are a lot of catalogs in Canada and the world that catalog scientific information, sort of like gray literature sometimes, other people refer to it as, and it has, what they've done is they've taken some data, like a geologist is a classic example. They're purveyors of information and knowledge because they take raw geological data, they interpret it, and they create beautiful pink maps, and that has a lot of knowledge embedded in those maps. So part of this challenge is how do we capture all that information and knowledge that already exists. So in Canada, there's the Polar Data Catalog out of the University of Waterloo, and internationally there's an Arctic Data Committee, and there are active discussions on how do we link these things. And the other thing we see a bit of a disconnect is, spatial data infrastructures are heavy on data, obviously, heavy on standards, heavy on governance, but you try to represent that narrative to a senior executive who may say, should I build this here? Do we need a port there? What do we do about health? Like really honest sort of questions. And you try to explain that in our very specialized geospatial language, and they don't want to hear data, they want to hear information. What do I do about this problem? So that's it for that presentation, and it's more or less to leave you some food for thought for the ongoing discussions. Thank you very much. Any questions? You want to do questions on the fly? Or?
Yeah, we'll do them on the fly.
Okay.
Good. Any questions for Cameron? Oh, you got two? Sorry.
I can speak up.
People online.
Oh, yeah, of course. So, okay, I was wondering why you think that the Yukon has so many more services than Nunavut. It seems like a drastic difference. Do you think that's related to mining, or?
It could be for a variety of reasons. It could just be the way they're structured, the way they publish things. It could be capacity. We haven't done that in-depth analysis. I've seen like an extreme example. I know the Geological Survey of Canada out of Halifax. They have one web service, I think like 1,500 layers in it or something. Okay. So people do different constructs of how they implement things. Yeah. So I didn't go into that level of depth. So hypothetically, NWT has 5 services, but Lord knows how many, the layer count and how things are published. So I don't have a clean answer to that. And by the way, the question was for people online is why does Yukon have so many web services? So I hypothesize that.
One more question?
It's more of a comment than a question. I like what you put forward as the 6-dimensional Arctic. There's no reason why that couldn't be extended to a 6-dimensional conceptual model of the Earth.
Well, exactly. So the question from the floor was just a comment actually about the ability to do something like this is quite feasible, the feasibility of it, and actually sort of leads into like things like Al Gore had at one point in time, digital Earth. So do you want to have a digital Arctic? What would that look like? Maybe 6 isn't enough. Maybe we need 7 or 8. I don't know. But we're trying to represent reality, and reality is very complex. It's not two-dimensional.
Exactly. Okay. Last question. So,
how does the 6 dimensions help capture traditional knowledge?
Well, I would say that falls under information and knowledge.
Or traditional data?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, the question from the floor is how do 6 dimensions capture Indigenous knowledge, right? And another way to sort of flip that question a little bit is I think we can learn a lot from Indigenous communities about how to actually manage our environment. So it's not just a take equation, it's also a give equation. So people choose to publish what they want to publish. Sometimes Indigenous knowledge can be sensitive, and sometimes it isn't. So I think part of these conversations should bring this out, and indeed this afternoon we have an Indigenous working group to try to figure that out a bit better.
So yeah, thank you. Please come this afternoon and bring all your thoughts with you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, next up is Tom Landry from the Computer Research Institute of Montreal, talking about natural disasters and extreme events.
Thank you, Trevor. So I wanted to, again, to link to the climate theme. So a few of the examples I will be showing are events that are maybe loosely related, or not related at all. For instance, if there is an earthquake somewhere in the west coast of Canada, obviously it's not climate related, but in the Internet of Things paradigm, you can have now in the geospatial world a lot of different sensors that allows you to monitor what's happening and to act. So you get those triggers, those events monitored, and then you can assess the situation and act accordingly, either to save life or, as I would say, an insurance company, assess the damages and prioritize the effort. So a lot of emerging technologies are happening at the moment the event is happening. So an example there is sending drone to do survey post disaster, so you can get a better sense of there was any landslides, any people need to be rescued, and anything else that's required actually to ensure security for the people. So these sources can go from sensor, but also from satellite information. You can, a lot of new satellites are sent every month or so. So we get more repeat pass, more information. We can see through clouds now with SAR remote sensing information. So we have really a lot of different options there. One example is Wildfire, and these are the two ones that we hear most often in Canada. So wildfire and flooding, these are the things that are keeping us busy, I would say. So on the left-hand side, you see the different triangles. So for instance, if I were to start a fire right here, would be something pretty localized, and something that is, let's say, a temporal aspect would be a fire that is for the next few minutes or seconds. So if I cut the fuel or the heat, the fire stops. So wildfire, it's a bit different. You still need fuels. It can be twigs on the ground or trees or whatever that is burning. And the oxygen now become more related to the weather. Will it be a lot of wind or it will be calm? Where will be the fire propagating due to that? And the topography is also important. So if a fire starts on top of a mountain, it will be quite different at the bottom of the mountain because of the propagation of heat. And also, of course, if a fire starts near a lake, it will probably not go through the lake or over the lake. So topography is very important at the wildfire. So something while it's happening during days or weeks, and in a medium scale fire. And for next decades, we talk about fire regimes. So weather becomes climate. How will the weather be modified? What will be the different effects of precipitation, of increased winds? So the problem become quite different. Same goes for vegetation. Nothing says that the vegetation that will grow in 50 or 100 years will be the same that grows today. And once it's burned, what will be coming afterwards might be different too. So vegetation is the primary fuel. And ignition, we speak about, I don't know, the probability where people are living. There are more sources of ignition, and for instance, lightning bolts and so on. So the CFS, the Canadian Forestry Service, is working on working on probability of those fires occurring. What you see here is based on modeling, on simulation. So they start fires on their computers, and they look how it propagates through the terrain. So they can use that to plan ahead. So once the fire is started, we need geospatial information to actually monitor the fire as it's going. So this is the type of work also done at the CFS, monitoring the burn scars from Earth observation. So what's required there is a bit also innovation. So you need better infrastructure because we get more data, we need it faster, so take better decisions. So the next few slides are provided by colleagues at Environment Canada, so I'm presenting on their behalf. And I apologize if I lack some of the nuance of climate languages, but I guess that will be okay. So as Cameron was mentioning, Canada's climate is changing, and the Arctic even faster. So there are also side effects of that. For instance, the oceans. Oceans are warming and getting more acidic, less oxygenated. So these are very important consequences, and sea level rise also will affect us in the future. So as part of initiative to provide more information to the Canadian deciders to take better decision, different portals are created in Canada. So Climate Atlas is one of them, and one that was created quite recently and led by my own institution, CRIM. It's climatedata.ca, so we'll present a few slides on this later. For analytics, sorry about this. For analytics, CRIM also worked on PAVIX, which is more on the analytics side of things. So here at OGC, we rely to that on WPS. So what is required to process either on the fly or offline some of the data. So these portals are available, for instance, to the service providers. Could it be the Prairie Climate Center, Uranus in Quebec, in the Pacific, and part of the initiative is to spur the creation of new regional consortium, for instance, in the Arctic, where there is a lack right now. So I invite you to check climatedata.ca for more information. So the feature that the portal offer, so going through location-based information, because people, when they are worrying about climate change, they're worrying about where they live, what they know. So enter the name of your city and you get high-resolution information on the climate data. Also on variable, I'll present those variables to you in a few minutes. and sector-based information. So what are the consequences on human health, and further modules that will also be developed. Arctic would be an interesting one, infrastructure, forestry, and so on. So we can download, analyze, visualize, discover that data through the portal. What is that data? Those are projection, climate projection, high resolution, so getting a 10 by 10 kilometers resolution. So that's and for all of Canada. So that's something that our users are quite surprised when they click everywhere in Canada and they get the trends and the projection for the various variables. So we get that for projection. We get also historical information through some data sets, so from 1950 to somewhere like 2010, I think. We get also access to the Canada Meteo weather stations, so current information that is coming from those stations. And something that is a bit more, technical or engineering sense, the IDF curve, so intensity, duration, and frequency curve. So when you look at this, you can get a better sense of the type of precipitation that you can expect in a location and build accordingly, for instance. So on temperatures, so the links between higher temperatures and, let's say, wildfires or other natural disaster, you can imagine it. So through those variables, so the hottest day that we can expect in the future, minimum, maximum temperatures, and some levels also, the number of days with higher than 30 degrees and so on. The temperature you can actually take better decision using that, and though the temperature will continue to rise in Canada, and obviously it will affect some of these, for instance, the heat on the ground and the wildfire propagation. Same goes for precipitation. So in Canada, precipitation are in general expected to increase, except some specific region in Canada. I think somewhere in the prairies in southern Canada, they might decrease. So if the precipitation decrease, more favorable condition for wildfires. And again, if there is an expectation of increased intensity of those precipitations, so very intense event might increase, so that can lead to urban flooding, for instance. So again, climatedata.ca offer some of these variables that can be downloaded on a grid level element, or soon we'll be able to download or to interoperate with different platforms. So you get that. So the wet days with very high level of precipitation, you can get a sense of that will change in the future. So note on the Canadian Centre for Climate Services was created a couple of years ago, and they are the ones that are currently supporting the first level for climatedata.ca, and they offer quite a lot of services. If you need to know a better understanding of the climate data, what are the limitations, what is the data that is available, how to use it, how to engage with the population. So they are the one that is really the expert, and they are linked to other experts in Canada and other centers, so they can help you to take those decisions. So I invite you to look at the Canadian Centre for Climate Services for more information. As a call for action, in the portal, in the climatedata.ca portal, there is a feedback page, is right there. So I query your feedback on what type of data you would be needing, what type of variable would be useful to you, would you be using more sensor-based information, if you need collaboration, maybe you have data to offer, maybe you want it to be interoperable with your own platform. So please reach us through the feedback. If you also need to know how to use that climate data, through that feedback you'll get support for either the Climate Services Support Desk, if there is a bug, or if you want to talk about standards or engineering, the same route would lead to us. And for governance, if you want to collaborate with us. So on that, I will leave the talk to Laura from Natural Resources Canada, and she will talk about water. So, Laura.
Hello. I am from the water program, part of the Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation, which is a part of Natural Resources Canada. So I thought we'd back up and talk about NRCan as a department. So we are seeking to enhance the responsible development and use of our natural resources in Canada. And we're seeing across the board that there's a growing demand for water in all these natural resources sectors. And we're seeing that decision makers need better information, like Cameron was mentioning earlier, and they're asking for this about water in all of its forms. That's not just surface water, that's also groundwater and permafrost and snow and wetlands, everything. So that's where we come in. We're looking for where our water is in Canada and how much there is. So I just wanted to mention briefly that our branch, CCMEO, does everything from research and design to actually disseminating geospatial products and services. So I just wanted to quickly go through our divisions. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I just wanted to let you maybe see some linkages between your organization and ours. So first, our remote sensing division is looking at remote sensing techniques to better understand water in all of its forms. Our Canadian Geospatial Data Infrastructure, that's where Cameron and Ryan work, is managing us with policies, standards, and governance practices, and is also sort of coordinating our Indigenous engagement activities. GeoBase is actually producing these geospatial data, like the National Hydro Network, which we'll talk about later. And our business office is working on agreements. They could be working on agreements with maybe some of your organizations in the future. That's what we're looking for. So agreements with research organizations like Global Water Futures, like the provinces and territories for data agreements, data sharing agreements. And finally, the Federal Geospatial Platform, that's where Cindy Mitchell works. That's where we actually disseminate this water data and other data too. And I'm from the water program, so we're coordinating all these water-related services and products and work, and we're just making sure that all the divisions are hitting the actual branches' water priorities and goals. Here's a very simplified program logic model. So we're a new program, we're about a year old, so we're here to kind of introduce ourselves to you and make connections. So from the old slide, the previous slide, all of those products and services, we're coordinating all these, and the output is a high quality, interoperable, and accessible data, services, and products, which in the hands of decision makers ideally leads to informed water resource management decisions, leading to the fact that Canadians are safeguarded from flooding, and that's a really, really big priority for us, as well as the fact that Canada's water resources are sustainable. And I would love to talk a lot about flooding, but I just don't have the time. But if you do have the time at 4:30, you should come to the EDM session to hear all about it. We're really excited about new opportunities in the water field, and we're looking for more opportunities, so that's why we're here, again, to kind of introduce ourselves to you. We're excited about new sensors like RCM, which hopefully the data will be accessible soon. WaterSat, SWAT, we're looking into these sensors, and hopefully we can find new applications for this in our branch. We're starting new research projects like building a cross-Canada flood mapping tool for general flood risk awareness. We're working on new remote sensing techniques for improving urban flood modeling and risk assessment, as well as doing a lot of dynamic surface water mapping, so it's like stacking, like satellite stacks, SAR and optical data. And that's not only to find a proxy indicator for flooding, flood risk, but also to update our water data. And we're looking to do just that. I think I saw Charles on the line from GeoBase, who's, I think, involved with the water feature extraction from LiDAR using machine learning, and that's also, I think that's the testbed, that's in the testbed 15 as well here. And yeah, we're doing experimental things like that, as well as updating our NHN. is our hydro network. Using Chief, that's also linked to the OGC, using high features definition, and basically adding more analytical capabilities to our data to make it more useful. We're interested in linked data, linking groundwater and surface water, and we know our colleagues in NRCan and here are working actively on that, and we're looking to create room for more data inputs for our NHN, just to make it a little more interoperable and a little more useful. So that's why we're here. We know that standards are the glue for our work, and we know that the OGC and the Canada Forum are a big part of that. We're using OGC standards and other standards in all phases of our data management cycle. And we're referring to them in our Federal Flood Mapping Guidelines series, which is the series of documents informing flooding best practices, which I'll talk about this afternoon. Yeah, so that's why we're here. I'm new to this, I'm new in the water program, and I'm just beginning to observe all these DWIGs and SWIGs, as I've heard that they're called, and these pilots and projects. So if you think that there's anything else that I could add to my observation list, please let me know. If you see any linkages between our organization and yours, and you want to collaborate or work on a project together or anything, please get in touch with me, either through my email here, or you can just come talk to me later. Again, I'm sorry I can't really talk too much about flood mapping, which I think you're all interested in this theme session. But again, come to the session at 4:30, and you'll get to hear me again. Thanks.
So we're about to do that. Any questions from people in the room for either Tom or Laura?
Or Environment Canada.
Or Environment Canada, who are online remotely. So. No questions? Did I miss anybody? No? Okay, and with that, I would like to introduce you to Andy Hogarth, who will talk to the theme of coasts and oceans. Andy is from Teledyne Caris. Andy?
We've got a flood at the front here.
I just created a flood.
So let's get the electronics safe for a second and then we'll proceed.
I'll get some paper towels from
I think you're safe.
Some here, true. Okay.
I think you're safe.
I'm told I'm safe to proceed. If you hear a pop and a bang, it's because I've been electrocuted. All right, so yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Andy Hogarth. As Trevor mentioned, I work for Teledyne Caris. We're a software development house specialising in ocean mapping software. We're based in New Brunswick on the east coast of Canada. For those not familiar with the New Brunswick accent, this isn't one. So my role in the Canadian Forum is to represent really the private sector from a perspective of economic development and growing the industry, the Canadian industry. And being an ocean mapper, I'm also kind of a viewpoint on the marine side of things. So I bring those two angles into the forum. So I'll run through a few topics here related to coast and oceans with a Canadian perspective. I just wanted to start off and pick up on the Hurricane Dorian point that I think Trevor referenced in his introduction. And many of us have seen, all of us I'm sure, have seen pictures like this over the last week or two on the news. This is from the Bahamas, and we can see the terrible damage inflicted by the storm surge that went along with the hurricane. I think, it was reported that 20 feet surge took place, and we can see the devastation there from this overhead image. Here's a map I found on the BBC from IC from Finland. The green line there is the coastline of Grand Bahama, and really the dark area at the bottom is the area that wasn't really flooded, so the higher ground. But we can see that entire North Shore was really inundated quite drastically by the storm surge related to Dorian. So as I was preparing for this Coast and Oceans or aspect of the Canadian Forum, I thought this just came to mind, the kind of impact of these sort of natural events and the disasters, and how flooding, as we heard from Laura, can come from different sources, and in this case, a surge related to a hurricane, in fact. So this reminded me of a project, a UNESCO project, that had some Canadian involvement, and this is why I wanted to dwell on it. Following the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean. So you might remember that Boxing Day tragedy that occurred over there. Well, following this disaster, there was a UNESCO project established called CoastMap.io, largely funded by the Italian Foreign Ministry, actually, at the time. But Canada got involved. Actually, I was involved in this from a capacity building perspective to try and look at the regions and countries involved and build capacity for future preparedness with regards to flood mapping, inundation mapping, and modelling in order to do that. So this project was the UNESCO project manager in the centre there was Dmitry Travin from Russia, and to the left is a younger version of me. This is going back some 10 years, I think now. And my colleague at the time, Serge Levesque, who I believe is actually online on this meeting today, was also with me. We were out in Thailand, in Bangkok, doing a couple of weeks training and capacity building in this area of flood mapping. The lady to the right in the white fatigues is a Thailand Navy oceanographer, Captain Parana, and the gents in brown uniforms were other Thai Navy representatives. We also had Sri Lanka there, a gentleman from Myanmar, and Mozambique, because the 2004 tsunami also went across the Indian Ocean and impacted that side too. So what I wanted to stress through this slide is the fact that Canada's got some expertise and it can share that globally, and I think that's a really important thing that we can bring. And really teaching software and techniques is one thing, but it's really a lot about relationships and developing friendships. And I remember during this mission we organised a internationals versus Thai Navy soccer game, and it really had this impact of bringing everybody together. And I'm pleased to say that the relationships that we developed through this mission, these are still retained to this day. So it's not always about knowing exactly the precise technical technique, but it's about knowing who to ask and how to connect. And I think Canada's got an important role to play in that area. So one of the things that we had to tackle when thinking about flood mapping and the coastal zone was how we bring land and sea data together. How do we combine a bathymetric seafloor model with a topographic, terrain model? How do we do that? And what's the challenges with regards to datums and strips of missing information in that ribbon that separates the land and the sea in the surf zone? The importance of standards quickly comes into play, and the importance of interoperability. So if we've got data for the marine piece in a specific format and the land data in another format, how do we bring this and harmonise this data together? So land and sea integration is a key aspect when we think about perhaps looking at the effects of a surge or a flood, but also in general in a context of marine SDI, understanding the relationships and bringing this information is quite critical. And this February we had an OGC meeting in Singapore, and we held a marine summit at this meeting, and bringing land and sea data together was a key aspect. And it's good to see that we've got Matt Pearce here this morning from Geoscience Australia, and Perry here as well, because what we managed to do for that event is bring a global bathymetric grid into Global Grid Systems' actual DGGS implementation and see, you know, this bathymetric terrain with topographic terrain within one DGGS. That was, in my mind, a good use of innovative standards to start to think how we can combine data from an analysis and a discovery perspective. Just picking up on Laura's point about machine learning, you know, my company's at the moment involved in trying to figure out how machine learning can be used to determine the land-sea interface. So if we're using LiDAR capable of, which has red and green laser, capable of detecting land and underwater information as well, seafloor data as well, then one of the key points is trying to determine the transition zone from the land to the seafloor. And we can use machine learning to do that. So this is one of the innovations that's going on at the moment. So we're going to talk more about some of the innovation topics with Gobi towards the end of this session this morning, but I just wanted to highlight a couple that I think are applicable. You know, there's a real interest in the oceans at the minute. You know, not a day goes by when we don't hear about ocean plastic and this dilemma. We see the natural disasters and of course the climate change topic and as well. So there's a real focus on the oceans at the minute, and this is good. This is good for me. One of these focal points is a project called Seabed 2030. And Seabed 2030 is a project between GEBCO. GEBCO stands for the General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean. And this is an IHO and IOC, that's the International Oceanographic Committee. This is a collaboration project, GEBCO, between these two organizations, in conjunction with a Japanese NGO called the Nippon Foundation. And this project team has decided that really we need a much higher resolution seafloor map of world bathymetry. And there's an objective to dramatically increase that resolution by 2030. So why is that important? What's the benefit of having this clear view? Well, on the left here, we can see the GEBCO bathymetric grid on this globe to the left. So this is a fairly low resolution bathymetric grid, but it's complete, made up of lots of transit data and surveys that have taken place over the last several decades. And to the right, we can see an overlay with that 2004 tsunami amplitude. So when you've got a high-res map of the ocean, you can start to see how the waves follow the oceanic ridges and the terrain and the topography down there. So armed with higher resolution data, we can be more predictive and precise about what future events, what the impact they may have. So just to give you a current picture on the state of ocean mapping, if you like, if we divided the world's oceans into 1 by 1 kilometre cells, we'd quickly find that 82% of them lacked any depth point, okay? So only 18% of the world's ocean is mapped at 1 kilometre resolution. Clearly in some of those cells there's many points, but at minimum. So there's a big job to do. So the objective of Seabed 2030 is to create a higher and variable resolution grid of the ocean so that we can use it in these predictive and analytical tasks that we might want to do. So why am I talking about this Seabed 2030 project? Well, it's just this focal point on the oceans again at the minute. How's Canada getting involved in that? Well, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, was the establishment of the Oceans Protection Plan. And this slide was provided to me by the Canadian Hydrographic Service, so I'm really presenting a couple of slides on their behalf here. So the National Oceans Protection Plan was a $1.5 billion injection into ocean science. Okay, this is quite phenomenal. This is a kind of generational thing, I think. The 5 pillars of the OPP was to support safe and clean marine shipping, to build partnerships with indigenous and coastal communities. There's an aspect of increasing economic development and opportunities for Canadians here. The improvement of maritime safety was another pillar in the OPP, and the protection of the marine environment. So I was looking online the other week and I came across this news release which was between the Department of Transport and Ocean Networks Canada out in Victoria there, and it was really about a pilot project to develop a maritime information system to allow Indigenous coastal communities to really gain benefit from the data that would allow them for improved decision making in these coastal communities. So this is a nice example of OPP funding really becoming a crosscut to allow, you know, spatial information to flow and be provided in a way that can be used by the people who really need to access that information. So you can take a read of that at your leisure. From a Canadian Hydrographic Service perspective, and the Canadian Hydrographic Service is part of Fisheries and Oceans, OPP has been a really important driver of innovation and survey and advancement. So these are 5 activities that are going on from a Canadian perspective as a direct result of OPP. Modern hydrography, modern charting, modern surveying is taking place in an additional 23 ports around Canada. The use of airborne LiDAR bathymetry is really being pioneered and used through this round of funding. So we're seeing lots of LiDAR surveys taking place, lots of new data sources to incorporate. We're exploring, CHS is exploring the use of new products and services, dynamic products and services, and I'm going to come back to that in the next slide. Importantly, there's a lot of hydrography and charting and surveying taking place in the Arctic. So this has been something that's really happening now, and it's important that this data can be turned around and incorporated for quick use. And the development and implementation of a marine SDI for Canada is another pillar of the OPP from a CHS perspective. So I've been involved heavily in the dynamic hydrographic products and services, and basically what we're using is native cloud technology approaches to take high resolution surveys in as short a turnaround time as possible and push that back out through web services to the people that might want to use it. So in this example, we can see high resolution bathymetry from Vancouver, from the Port of Vancouver, and we're combining that with dynamic tidal and current input to really calculate on the fly the amount of available water underneath the vessel. So if you've got a real-time picture of bathymetry, depth, and the dynamics, then you can start to decide, can that ship sail into port smoothly and safely? And this is important because this is one of the questions we want to answer as we start to think about autonomous shipping. We hear a lot about autonomous cars and this kind of thing. Well, it's not too far away that ships will certainly be doing transoceanic voyages in an autonomous way. So if you're going to sail somewhat autonomously, then you need to have the data at your disposal to make the right decisions. So this is an example of a new project that's come out through OPP, where OGC web services are being used to determine how that flow of information can exist. One other point I wanted to talk about from a Canadian perspective is the Maritime Limits and Boundaries project that we've heard a little bit about. We've seen referenced in a couple of the earlier presentations. What's neat about this initiative is it's multi-organisational. The OGC infrastructure is being used to progress and develop an International Hydrographic Organisation, IHO standard. So we've got an IHO standard that's being utilised in the OGC's infrastructure and the ISO standards to really have a full picture and a full view of how we can develop standards between different organisations. So it's quite an exciting project, and we had a long meeting on this yesterday to look at progress, and sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the S121 standard from a IHO perspective. So Canada's been a real pioneer in this project, NRCan, CHS, along with the Australians, the Aussies and the Brits as well. And basically we're working with industry, like the company I represent and others who are here this week as well, to really evolve this standard so that we can define maritime boundaries, which may be legal, or they could be fisheries related, or marine protected areas, many different things. But if we can define these in a common way so that we can share these boundaries interoperably between organisations, that's really the goal of this. So yeah, just a good example of where Canada's really been a pioneer in this space. There'll be a presentation on S121 and the maritime limits and boundaries in the Marine DWIG this afternoon, which just so happens to be at the same time as Laura's DWIG, so I'd probably go to Laura's. Sounds fun. Either one, you can maybe dip into each. Okay, just to conclude then, so I think you'll agree, understanding our coasts and oceans, it's critical. It's critical for answering questions about the Arctic. I think it's critical for natural disaster preparedness of certain types. And I think as we looked at that Bahamas example, as we start to think about smart and sustainable communities, you know, this is an important factor. And we think about, you know, these coastal communities and the impact of a storm surge or a flood. We can understand the types of technological challenges that we have. So I think Canada's got an opportunity, a really great opportunity to be a leader in this area. And, you know, I just wanted to put some thoughts out there for you, and happy to take any questions on this topic that you might have.
Questions for Andy?
Or online, if there's any.
Hi, Andy.
Hey, Cameron, yeah.
Standards development can be slow. Some organizations are very old organizations in that regard. Just what's your opinion on how to sort of fast track things to respond to these things?
Yeah, so Cameron's point was that standards can be sometimes slow to develop, and the organisations developing them, you know, sometimes have a lot of bureaucracy and red tape to, you know, that allow things to, you know, take some time. I think through these collaboration opportunities like the Maritime Limits and Boundaries pilot, we're seeing for one of the first times really how we can leverage infrastructure that exists at the OGC to perhaps see if that can expedite a hydrographic standard to be defined. So I don't think we know the answer yet, but I think the mere fact that there's, you know, inter-organisational standards development going on now will allow us to draw conclusions to determine whether there's other standards that can follow the same pattern. So I think this is quite an exciting project because of these different organisational standards groups that are involved. So let's see. Hopefully we can do more in this similar way. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Andy. Next up, we have Bradford Dean from the Mohawk Council of Gananoque to talk about the theme of smart and resilient communities. Brad? I won't knock that one over.
Thank you, Trevor. As Trevor had already mentioned, we are living in interesting times. I'd like to point out there was an article that was released by the OGC in 2015 called the Smart Cities Spatial Information Framework Paper, where it was identified that about 54% of the world's population are living in cities. And that was referenced to a World Health Organization paper in 2014. There was another paper, the World Bank in 2016, that identified 82% of the world's population, 82% of Canada's population are living in cities. So for sure, this country is a leader in this trend.
Bradford, you want to pull the mic a bit closer?
Oh, I'm sorry, could you hear me? I didn't realize that I was talking on my own there. Okay, yes, so basically there is a trend of the world's population migrating to the cities. And Canada is foremost in this trend. 82% are living in cities in Canada. And also with regards to reserves, Aboriginal reserves, there is an increased population on these territories. I know that in one case, population exploding in one location in North Manitoba called Puckatawagan of a population between two. It's a small reserve of 2,000 to 3,000 people, but half of the population is 15 years of age or younger. So this is also a trend that Aboriginal reserves are young in population, and so we do have a challenge then to find a solution to streamline the infrastructure, the information infrastructure for increased populations of our communities and cities. And I'll talk about smart cities and communities, and then I'll talk about resilient cities and communities. So yes, there's an increasing ever demand to meet the needs of effective governance for these cities and communities. So I guess we can begin with the definition, and I know that the Natural Resources Canada had created an all-encompassing definition, which is a really good starting point to meet this new challenge that we are going to be facing. So the NRCan had begun a research project that was one year duration, and they created this definition, and it's worth repeating that their definition of a smart city, according to the Open Smart Cities Guide, where residents, civil society, academics, and the private sector collaborate with public officials to mobilize data and technologies when warranted in an ethical, accountable, and transparent way to govern the city as a fair, viable, and livable commons and balance economic development, social progress, and environmental responsibility. So this is a good starting point. This is from their Open Smart Cities Guide that was just released this year. So we do have an example of smart cities. There is the one in Toronto that is currently underway. It involved between 1 and 2 billion Canadian dollars to create. It's located within the eastern waterfront of Toronto, and it is using digital infrastructure and interoperable shared technology that they will tackle problems such as affordable housing, traffic congestion, environmental impact, and reducing energy consumption, as well as flooding prevention. It should be interesting to note that the future Canadian headquarters of Google is planning to move into the district. And also that there had been a Smart Cities Challenge that was given to Canada. It was a pan-Canadian competition open to all municipalities, local or regional governments, and Indigenous communities. The challenge empowers communities to adopt smart cities approach to improve the lives of the residents through innovation, data, and connected technology. And I should like to point out that there had been some winners of this competition, which were Montreal is one of the winners, as well as Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, Nunavut, and Guelph and Wellington District in Ontario. So we talked about smart cities and communities. Now I'd like to move on towards resilient communities. And this term is somewhat of a gray area. There had been yearly conferences, I think is in Bonn, where they looked at this definition. And as it turned out, there has not been a common ground as to what this could mean. There are different ways of defining what a resilient community is. There are some definitions that you can apply on a spectrum of concepts. On one concept, we have a very efficient, resilient community, which relies upon limited, although limited resources, it's very strong in operability. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a very redundant or resilient or less efficient form of resiliency. And that's best exemplified by this diagram I have here, where an efficient city or community is one that is highly structured and organized, but it is, shall we say, fragile. Like in the event of a catastrophe, an efficient style, resilient community would not have the ability perhaps to, or the infrastructure to meet the demand of a crisis. Whereas a resilient city or community, which share responsibilities and organizations and personnel, so that in the case of a crisis, it should be able to meet the demand of a crisis. So one of the conclusions that was made from one of these conferences is in Bonn, was put forward that there can be a trade-off between efficiency and resilience, depending on the circumstances or the specific community where they would define their own goals or needs to address. And so I'd like to direct you to an example that I've been working on in my community. As mentioned earlier by Trevor, I work in the Maha Council of Ganawage. My job title is GIS Manager, and I work under the Information Management Unit. And so one of my tasks is to bring representatives from different departments that we call units, and together we have monthly meetings, and we basically where I help them contribute data to a layer, to different layers that we could use for our community. So for example, I have an example here where the lands units, where they have survey data, they contribute the parcel data for a GIS layer. The capital unit, they have the zoning information, and KIPO, which stands for Ganawage Environmental Protection Unit, they provide layers that show where the biodiversities are, the biodiversity hotspots that are no-go zones for construction. And from the public safety unit, of course, they have the emergency location map, where they have the road network and address system placed there. And so these different layers that basically are used to help decision makers to decide how to, in a smart way, grow how to plan ahead for the growing community. And I think I will stop there. So thank you.
Any questions for Brad?
Craig, can you just comment on the last sentence at the bottom right? Just expand upon that.
The bottom right, the trade-off between efficiency and resilience.
The last sentence, the measuring resilience means to focus on indicators.
I'm sorry, I don't see.
The last sentence. At the bottom right.
This one right here. Unique, that one.
Okay, sorry. Yes, measuring resilience means to focus on unique indicators specific to context. So what I meant by that was we can't use my community, the Mohawk Ganawage community, as a cookie cutter for other cities or reserves or communities, but rather each community must identify what is important to them and basically use that as an organizing principle around which a goal can be reached. To measure how they can meet the demands for their resilience, and identify their own indicators in order to measure success in achieving that goal.
Other questions?
Trevor? Use the microphone.
I'll just speak the question and then we'll repeat it online. So.
So the concept of resilient community is interesting. I was wondering what your perspective of this is as it applies to indigenous communities, because we as we know, many Indigenous communities in Canada are facing a lot of challenges regarding water infrastructure, basic infrastructure, things like that. But there's also a lot of investments being made by the government to try to improve this. So do you think that with those investments, we're actually taking resilience into account in an appropriate way, or should we be looking at it more in a larger context when we're making these investments?
The question is the Government of Canada and the Canadian community investing in ensuring that there's resilience in a lot of northern and remote communities who have a lot of challenges with water quality, amongst other things. And the question is for Brad.
Okay. Yes, thank you. That is a very good question. I should mention that my background is in information management, and in terms of political questions, I can't really answer completely. However, I do know that from my perspective that we have been in dialogue with Transport Canada, for example, where we have created a map that identified the ships and the coastal integrity around Ganawage, and I know that they've been working with other Indigenous reserves, so there is assistance in that regard. And it is important to also mention that it's not a good idea for Aboriginal reserves to work in isolation, that there is always some kind of connection to reach a common ground for helping to identify what resiliency is in need and how to address it.
I was just wondering what resilience indicators might have been the most helpful so far, and also how do you test those? Do you run scenarios? Just kind of curious about that.
Okay, well, in the case of many Indigenous reserves, there is less, there's not a lot of money, and so running risk hazard tests can't really be useful to them. But in terms of increasing resilience, my guess would be to have perhaps a more redundant form of answer to creating a resilient community, having different stakeholders, different individuals who can contribute solving problems at hand, that in case one person is taken out or if there is a disaster, there'll be sufficient numbers of people in different fields that can step in and help to resolve.
This is more of a question for the standards people, like the OGC people maybe in the room. So in remote communities are remote by definition. So I was at the geopackaging SWG yesterday, and it seemed like my perception was when I left is that was a standard between highly developed organizations. The conversation in the room was a very, from NASA to this organization and ESA. Can geopackage be used like in a remote community? Like if you're a remote community and you have low capacity, is geopackage friendly enough for areas that have really poor bandwidth?
So the question from Cameron at NRCan is geopackage really fit for purpose for truly remote locations? I, as an OGC guy, can't answer that. Gobe, maybe you have some comment?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it is, when it was designed, one of the key use cases was use in, remote environments and what we tend to refer to as DDoS, right, intermittent, disconnected, and the other, but basically
denied,
yeah, there we go, environments. And with every initiative that we've had with regard to GeoPackage, the sponsors, the various OGC initiative sponsors, they've always made sure that there's a detailed use case in there, and they have been able to prove that it works within those environments. Well, what we've been looking at as well is the processes for change management. So in testbed 15, we're referring to that as delta updates. So basically how you synchronize between the master database and the GeoPackage and enable that continuous cycle of updates, use and updates and so on. So the answer is yes, it can be used in remote environments.
Okay. So to me, this suggests, and although I'm stealing a bit of Gobe's thunder because he's the next speaker, this suggests that this is something to talk about this afternoon, about a potential practical item to do, which is to take geopackage into a truly remote area and see if it is valuable. So anyway, sorry, Bradford. We should probably move on. Thank you, Bradford. All right, so next up, speaking of technology and trends, so we have Gobe Hobona from OGC staff. He is talking on tech trends and growth. Although some of us heard the tech trends presentation this morning, he will attempt to connect more to the Canadian context. So yeah. I'll wait till you, Gobe.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good morning. Trevor, thank you for that introduction. So for the next few minutes, I'll give you an overview of OGC's technology trends activity and also how we pull the lessons learned from it into the OGC innovation program and ultimately into OGC standards and related specifications. Just an outline of the presentation. So just as I outlined a few seconds ago, but in addition to that, one other thing I'll do is to highlight how it relates to innovation theory or some of the approaches and considerations in terms of innovation theory, which is something that we always keep in mind within the technology trends activity. So first of all, it's been said numerous times that more than 80% of the information that policymakers rely on has some form of location reference within it. And what the implication of that is that you'll find that geospatial information is quite literally everywhere, and it's used in all different aspects of society in support of industry, government, learning, and other areas. And over the past 2 or 3 decades, we've seen quite a number of technologies have an impact on pretty much every sector that's out there. We've had technologies such as GPS and other global navigation satellite systems. We've seen those have an impact in in big corporations, small and medium-sized enterprises. But we've also seen other technologies, emerge and be applied to areas of science. For instance, unmanned aerial vehicles. And I bet most people in the room have got a smartphone, which probably has a GNSS chip embedded within it, or global navigation satellite system chip embedded within it. And all these innovations have transformed how we carry out our daily activities as a society. But the key thing that we always ask ourselves is, what's next? What's the next big innovation that is going to change how we do things? Now, I'm not going to claim to have an answer to that, but I will try as best to share some of our thinking in terms of what we see is likely going to happen within the geospatial industry specifically. So first of all, some thoughts on innovation theory. Within the area of within innovation theory, we tend to distinguish between sustaining innovations and disruptive innovations. Sustaining innovations are those that tend to be developed with the idea of being to reinforce or to ensure that an organization secures its position in a market. So they tend to be incremental. But then you have disruptive innovations, which provide a step change. So they're introduced and, within a specific time frame, they cause a step change in how, a society uses them, or how an industry, tackles a particular need. The book on the slide is by Clayton Christensen. It's called The Innovator's Dilemma. It tends to be the reference text for this characterization of innovation. Christensen uses the disk drive industry as an example, but there are several aspects of it that are transferable to any technology, any technology-based market. There've also been new follow-on books by the same author, but this particular one is one we tend to reference. So the key point here is that there are two types of approaches to innovation: one for sustaining one's position in the market, but another one for potentially disrupting and entering a new market. So as an organization, you will have considered how you might be able to innovate, how you might be able to develop new products, or to come up with policies that transform how your jurisdictions actually interact with your products. And there are quite a number of variables that tend to have an impact on decisions, an impact on investment, an impact on what technologies you actually go for first, or what technologies you invest in first. Some of those are shown on the slide. So for instance, there's risk. The risk of adopting a new technology, or the risk of even failing to adopt a new technology. But there's also the impact. So the impact of a new technology within a particular market. That impact tends to also relate to other things such as benefication. So at what point the end user will basically benefit from that particular innovation. And then there's speed, cost, and so on. All of these considerations have an impact on whether organizations adopt a new technology or not, and when they might choose to do so. So within the OGC, what we've done is to initiate technology trends activity to help OGC members prepare for emerging technologies, to help them prepare for those technologies, but also to help them identify which technologies they might wish to take advantage of or to use to build their own portfolios. So the technology trends activity, which is led by George Percival, the Chief Technology Officer of the OGC, it produces a quarterly report. And the data to support that report we publish on a GitHub website. So this mind map is produced by that activity. This specific mind map was published in June. I expect we'll be seeing an update to it potentially by the end of this TC. So the mind map identifies a number of technology trends that we expect will have an impact on the geospatial industry and also geospatial standards as well. So some of these, in fact, you already have some experience in terms of how they influence what you do back at the office, or how you interact with your end users. So not only do we develop the mind map, but we also provide an assessment of those technology trends to identify those that should, should be considered to be higher priority ones, those that the OGC should explore and sooner rather than later. And I should point out that we don't do this by ourselves as staff. We have reached out to OGC members to collect their input. And OGC members have been really great in in engaging and providing their experiences, and so this is not just our view as staff, but it is reflective of what as a community the OGC sees as technology trends that are likely to have an impact moving forward. Another thing to point out is that the way we organize the technology trends, we thought about, okay, should we provide a schedule or a roadmap as to when those technology trends are probably going to have an impact. But we ultimately arrived at a two-stage timeline of next and after next. And we see this as the most accurate way of representing basically how these technologies will evolve. So for the next few minutes, I'll quickly go through the high priority ones. First, there's data science. Data science is a multidisciplinary field that uses scientific methods and processes as well as systems to enable the extraction of knowledge from both unstructured and structured data. There are quite a number of areas that we're already seeing great potential and that are likely to have an impact on geospatial standards. For instance, text and graph analytics. An example of this is, for instance, extraction of place names, for instance, from social media to help commercial organizations to plan their marketing strategies. That's just an example. Spatial temporal analytics, with one example being the discrete global grid systems concept, which OGC has been heavily involved in developing standardization for. Then there's machine learning. Over the past 2 or 3 years, we've had quite a lot of activities within the OGC Innovation Program looking at machine learning approaches such as convolutional neural networks. And Natural Resources Canada has been a significant supporter of that work within the OGC Innovation Program. Then there's another area is that of unmanned aerial vehicles, as well as unmanned aircraft systems. So unmanned aircraft systems refer to the broader collection of technologies, concepts, and other enablers that make it possible to have UAVs in operation. Now, what we are seeing within the research area is greater emphasis towards teaming of UAVs. So this is teaming between UAVs or teaming between UAVs and unmanned underwater vehicles or autonomous underwater vehicles. We're seeing teaming between UAVs and satellite systems, but the key focus is greater emphasis towards combining UAVs with some other platform or some other sensor, even humans as well, so human-machine teaming. But also in addition to this, there's greater emphasis on the counter UAV side. Now, I live 14 miles from Gatwick Airport, so I usually fly from Gatwick Airport, and you probably recall in December, quite a number of flights were cancelled at Gatwick because of problems. Somebody decided to fly, UAVs in controlled airspace. So, counter UAVs are something that are very important. We had a presentation at the Unmanned Systems Domain Working Group in Singapore from one of our members about how they are approaching this particularly important topic. And then there's IoT, so Internet of Things and edge computing. So historically, we've seen the IoT focus on using end devices as means of collecting data and sending that data into the cloud and having the data processed out in the cloud and the results presented to end users. But what we're now seeing is should I say, the next step in that process, which is the edge computing side. So having the edge devices actually perform some of that computational processing themselves, and have less reliance on the cloud for processing. So we're seeing quite a lot of work being done in that area. And at a recent Future Directions session, we had a speaker from an ISO working group that is looking into edge computing. Within the OGC, we're also running a mixed reality at the edge initiative. And this is looking at how you might be able to use edge computing and edge devices to support mixed reality that includes virtual reality and augmented reality applications. And then finally, there's also a greater emphasis towards industrial Internet of Things, and how we might be able to use it to support indoor mapping to provide richer experiences for end users. So I'll quickly go through this one. So with the web of data, so historically we've had concepts such as the semantic web and linked data, put forward. But what we are seeing now is that those communities are working much more closely with the geospatial community. We have organizations such as the World Wide Web Consortium doing joint specifications with the OGC, and that has led to standards that are location aware and also able to meet the needs of the linked data community. But we're also, within the OGC, we're also doing work on APIs for the web APIs. You've heard this week about OGC APIs for features, coverages, processes, and others as well. And then another area is that of web scale platforms. So perhaps over the past 5 years, what we've seen is a number of platforms being developed to support Earth observation. Some of those platforms tend to be enterprise platforms, but what we're now seeing is greater use of resources that are out there. So, public clouds working in conjunction with private clouds to create, some form of hybrid cloud environment that is able to provide, web scale capabilities that, for processing and for, leveraging resources both on both the enterprise side and the wider web as well. Then there are another topics that of the digital twin. So being able to represent, objects, and not just objects of all sorts, so even human beings as well. Being able to represent physical objects within a virtual environment in order to help, support areas such as healthcare, for instance, but also to enable citizens in a smart city environment to get services from their city officials, or to enable cities to support their city residents more effectively. So we're seeing digital twin concepts being applied in so many wide areas, and that creates opportunities for Canada, at various levels, from cities right through to regional governments, how they might be able to to support their residents. Using geospatial technologies that are capable of supporting the digital twin concept. So those are some of the things that we are seeing coming through through academia and other areas. And then finally, Industry 4.0. Particularly on the smart manufacturing side, that's something as well that we're seeing and will most likely have an impact on, on the geospatial community within the next few years. Finally, modeling, simulation, and prediction. So being able to provide logical and mathematical abstractions of the real world or the physical world in order to represent events, in support of training, education, or even planning. So we're seeing quite a lot of work being done in this area, and within the OGC, we've set up arrangements with other standards development organizations that focus on modeling and simulation. We have a working group that's doing quite a lot of work on interoperable gaming and simulation. And that is actually having an impact on how we understand we might be able to take advantage of emerging technologies such as connected and autonomous vehicles. At a recent Future Directions meeting, we gave a presentation that showed a video that one of our members is using to help cities understand how they might be able to adapt and support connected and autonomous vehicles. Built environment modeling, I won't go into this one because we talked about it this morning, but I'll point out predictive analytics and machine learning. So there's quite the the convergence of modeling, simulation, and prediction is creating opportunities for predictive analytics and machine learning. The work that we're doing in testbed 15, the work that we did in testbed 14, all of that is helping us understand how, as a community, we'll be able to leverage this particular technology trend. So just 2 more slides. So how are we taking those technology trends and pushing them into standards? Well, we're doing this through both the innovation program and the standards program. Within the innovation program, we have a number of innovation types, innovation initiative types. So testbeds, pilots, plugfests, hackathons, sprints, research projects. All of these are giving us an opportunity to explore those technology trends and see how they might be able to improve geospatial interoperability, but also how they might be able to improve the geospatial industry as a whole. And the lessons from the innovation program, through the work done by the standards working groups, the domain working groups, subcommittees, as well as the regional forums, those lessons are being taken and applied, included in specifications such as OGC standards, best practice, and so on, in order, to help our members and other implementers beyond the membership to basically leverage the insight and lessons and capabilities of those technology trends to apply them to their own portfolios. And those portfolios could be, policies and requirements from, government departments, or solutions, products and services from commercial organizations and academia. So effectively, that is how we are, identifying technology trends, using what we've learned from those technology trends to shape our innovation program, and how the lessons from the innovation program are influencing the standards program. So in conclusion, we're seeing an increasing role for geospatial technologies in every aspect of society, but that role depends on us being able to identify technology trends and see how, as a community, we might be able to leverage them within our standards and our technologies. But also, geospatial interoperability is acting as a catalyst for innovation. So, global navigation satellite systems they've had an impact, everywhere. So, but standards also are making it possible for non-geo communities to be able to leverage location, to be able to make use of location within their own solutions. And finally, OGC maintains an ideas repository on GitHub, and that's the URL. Feel free to visit the website and share some of your thoughts as to what the OGC should be doing in this area. And that's it. Thank you.
Any questions for Gobe? Thank you, Gobe.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for attending the session this morning. For those of you online, I'm just going to go into a few details about what happens this afternoon. And thanks again for attending online. If you have any questions, you feel free to contact myself or any of the co-chairs. Our email contact points are on the Canada Forum Wiki, the open link I gave earlier. So thanks. So a few instructions about this afternoon. Better get my glasses so I can read this. We've struck this afternoon into 4 breakout groups. And once again, the breakout groups are intended to motivate, discuss, and identify work items, and ultimately find some volunteers to work together as a community to solve some of the problems. So working group number 1, innovation in the economy. We identified 2 sort of general work items over the past 18 months. One is for the community to work together to create an innovation showcase, which would be a fairly seamless story or narrative that would basically showcase Canadian innovation technology, as well as showing how we're solving real-world problems in the north, floods, wherever, coasts, marine. The second one is to revisit the concept of, or revitalize the concept of looking at trade missions. The Canadian geomatics sector used to actually have quite a number of trade missions, at least once per year, sometimes twice per year, to various emerging markets, because from the Canadian perspective, the Canadian private sector, a lot of companies are, very dependent upon export incomes for growth, and in certain cases survival. Some not so much, but the vast majority really need the incomes. And we could, the idea came up to say, okay, well, let's go back to showing up again in the world and showing off what we do well to help. The second one is cross-community practices, standards roadmaps, policy hackathons, priority issues, that sort of thing. The third is academia, basically, and research actually, which is a case of, from the consultation we did over the past couple of years, this is the least defined one, but the facilitators have some ideas on what things to do. And then Indigenous groups. Two solid ideas have come out of this through a needs assessment study funded by NRCan and done by Hatfield for northern remote and Indigenous communities. They identified a need for the delivery of regular data packets, which may include tools, which may include capacity building, which may include all sorts of things. So one of the ideas is how can the Canadian community contribute to making more of these, for example. That's just an idea. Please don't take that as anything other than, it's a discussion point. And also a conversation about potential creation of an Indigenous geospatial leadership team. Because one of the other things that came out of the needs assessment was a very, very, and we heard this from Bradford actually earlier today as well, was a very strong need for Indigenous and Aboriginal communities to do nation-to-nation collaboration, because the capacity of one group compared to the capacity of another one can be an order of magnitude difference. So the study identified that that is a possible thing. So on your way out, there should be a sign-up sheet somewhere. Please sign up for one of these breakout groups. Please bear in mind that we're trying to stay cross-community, so try not to create silos. Like we don't want all the private sector people over there and all the academics over there. So if you're willing to work with maybe a little bit outside of where your core reasons are, that would be great. And beyond that, sorry?
Where specifically do we sign up?
Okay.
This is academia.
Thank you. This is Ali Marshall. She's our graphic artist. So academia over there.
Innovation and economy is here. Indigenous communities is on the other side of the pillar, and the standards community of practice is on the far wall. And we're still filling these in, but the ones with the red circles on them are where you can put your name, and feel free to use your pen or the markers that are at the flip charts.
Okay. And just so you know, everybody is welcome, including non-Canadian organizations. Just be aware that if you want to be tasked to do work for Canada, join us. That joking, but everybody is. Forums are open by definition. Last point. The weather is supposed to get a little nasty later today, so we are planning perhaps an informal event just across the road at the Three Ravens pub later after. So please come back around about 1-ish. We have this room for quite a while after this point, but the idea is each of the facilitators of the group will come back and report back results after the process. So thanks very much, and don't run away. See you at 1. One question?
Everybody scan in, please. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Including you.
Yeah, I haven't scanned in yet either. So if everybody could scan in on the way out, or scan out on the way in, however you want to put that, please do. And we may not let you out unless you sign up for something. I'm joking. So thanks, everybody. See you at 1 o'clock.
Those Banff is here from Australia. Are we going to allow them, those Aussies in our meeting?
I guess so.
Spies.
We're going to disrupt things out here.
Good.
Got up early in the morning. It's an hour and a half. Come back. It's good.
Is that right up? I guess the service one. Oh, sure. Yeah,
It takes more, so much time to get on.
So difficult, isn't it?
I did. I had GoToMeeting running on my phone.
Oh, okay.
They're really on time, so.
That's fine. All right. Good to be fair. Well, the timing was good, Trevor, wasn't it?
It worked out perfectly.
Couldn't get any better than that.
We had agreed to have lunch.
Tomorrow, so.
Oh, it's tomorrow.
I thought, well, I'm sorry, I thought it was tomorrow, so.
It's Wednesday. Okay, so then can you let Gordon know?
Yes.
Because he said he was coming because he couldn't make it today. So tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow. Sorry for the confusion, because I knew today I was.
Yeah, because that's what I thought. But, and then Gordon said he couldn't make it. So,
Okay, so tomorrow.
So
Okay.
you tell Gordon.
I will send him an email.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Well, yes,
Let's go up there. Oh yeah. I have a short sleeve on there on the door, so I better check the weather.
Good job, Trevor.
What do you call it? I know
Now you're my best friend. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, okay, that's awesome. So let's coordinate on a time. Because I'm open to meals.
I'm surprised how that works.
Yeah, let's figure it out. That's fantastic. Does Tom want to like anybody who wants to, we can always grab if there's more to bring it back. That's
Good job. Oh, thanks. A little bit more. I'm thinking of your analogy of the quilting, so I'm trying to weave a few things together. I think I'm going to pass on the lunch over there and just grab some takeout from downstairs. And also get those flowcharts up for the breakout sessions. Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, somebody would probably need to upscale a little bit digitally. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was trying to think of how
The assumptions are contraction.
and I still, yeah, I still got to listen to.
500-year, 100-year floodplain map has to be updated.
Outside of it, something like the Maritime Boundary Spatial, outside of the outside of it, be another boundary, which is the official.
You're reminding me actually what I had thought about doing. I was thinking about doing it as more of a process, showing the continental crust going down to the ocean.
Every other year.
One of the sides of the
I'm still wondering this.
This one is here. I think
You should just turn the cameras around, point it out that way. Much better.
Oh, wherever you want to sign up. Yeah. Well, that was.
Oh, we're over to.
Is it working?